50 states. When was the last time that each of them got wrecked by weather? And spoiler alert, I will not be hitting all 50 because I will be going in chronological order. And this is only states, not territories. So I kind of feel bad for people in territories who have to deal with destructive impacts who will be getting ruthlessly excluded from the video. This will also be brief. I'm not going to go in depth about the event. I'm just going to give you basic statistics. Like in Florida, it was Category 4 Hurricane Ian that was the most recent storm to wreck the state. But we all know what happened. And with 131 deaths and, $67 billion in damage, it's hard to argue to the contrary on how destructive Fiona was. How destructive Ian was for Florida. As far as the next state, Kentucky, because that's the next state that I could at least confirm where the impacts were. I have to look at everything else for those statistics. Kentucky, which is already wrecked by tornadoes in December, saw 40 deaths and likely billions of dollars in damage due to flooding in, due to flooding in the eastern part of the state in July. It was part of the nationwide floods of July to August, which were in a pretty similar synoptic setting, but this is the most infamous. And if you're wondering why I excluded Mississippi, I don't exactly know why I thought to exclude that, but I still do stand by it. I guess because the impacts were minimal, except for the boiled water, which, I don't know, without the large loss of life, and given how it's in a limited area, I'm hesitant to argue that it wrecked the whole state. But after Kentucky, I talked about how weather was really sparing for a while. And because of the overlapping events, I'd have to actually go back to New York and New Jersey due to Ida. $8 to $10 billion in damage in New Jersey with 30 lives lost. New York saw 18 lives lost with $7.5 to $9 billion in damage. Heavy damage in both in the entirety of the New York metro area. New York and New Jersey both saw destructive impacts. In case you're wondering, and before you like Angie being biased, because this was only a downstate thing. First of all, it is the primary population center of New York, but impacts did stretch up into the Hudson Valley, the destructive ones at least. And the thing is that New York is one of those states where without New York City, the whole state would pretty much just collapse. New York relies on New York City. Part of the reason the capital was in Albany was to weaken New York City's influence, but it's still very, very strong on the state. So New York City, if the city is affected by weather severely that causes a lot of deaths, it affects the whole state in some way, in some very negative ways. In New Jersey, of course, in New York, just look at the photos of the subways, just look at photos of Hoboken during the flash flooding event. They are quite disturbing. And I will warn you of that. Ida also ranked Louisiana as a Category 4 with 32 deaths and $55 billion in damage. Oregon and Washington were wrecked by heat waves that saw 112 deaths in Oregon, 116 in Washington, billions of dollars in damage, and quite a lot of property damage effects as well. Texas was wrecked by a cold wave, so pretty unusual how these events could turn out geographically. The Great Texas Freeze, anywhere between 250 and 1,000 deaths due to this, and the winter storm that ensued, which dumped up to 15 inches of snow in Texas, which is really unusual, and nearly $200 billion in damage. However, before this, again, states getting really wrecked by weather the same way, not exactly as common. And it's hard to really argue drought the same way. Now, in 2000 and In 2020, obviously COVID had nationwide impacts. But the weather that year was somewhat sparing, at least for the United States. Now, there were still some hard hits by the weather, but really 2021's weather overall turned out to be worse. That did not mean, however, that 2020 was not without impacts. Just look at the lightning wildfires across California. That and a drought really did kind of cause destructive impacts across the state. 23 deaths, hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. I would argue that given how widespread these wildfires were in a drought, between all of this and everything that continued, California was really wrecked by this whole drought. So we've already eliminated a lot of states. Not eliminated, but went through a lot of states. 2020 did see a lot of tornado outbreaks that caused a lot of heavy impacts across, like, everywhere. So as far as how the events go, because I'm starting to draw a blank, I'm sorry about this. Well, let's think about this step by step. So 2020 saw a lot of hurricanes, but the most destructive one was Louisiana. Lua, which primarily impacted Louisiana, which is already crossed off our list. So we can't use that. Besides that, there wasn't anything else too standoutish. Besides Eta and Iota, which primarily wrecked Central American countries like Nicaragua and Honduras, amongst others. Now, tornadoes were destructive in the beginning part of the year, but they kind of began to wear down their impacts by the end of the year. There was a derecho event in Iowa that arguably wrecked the state, but there were similar ones in December of 2021, and they didn't include that. Maybe this one caused more damage. It did cause $11 billion, making it America's costliest thunderstorm. It caused 4 deaths, and only 3 of those were in Iowa. But the damage in Cedar Rapids, as well as Des Moines, were pretty substantial. Given the agricultural impact, despite the large loss of life, I will in fact argue that the Midwest derecho did in fact wreck Iowa. And I know that was a pretty intense result to get. And again, if you're wondering why these videos are just keep going unedited and in crappy condition, that's just because I can't figure out how to edit. Anyway, will 2020 see other of these very destructive events? Well, in my estimations, the answer is no. June, didn't really see anything. May, didn't really see anything. April did see the Easter outbreak, but it was pretty split up. If I were to argue anywhere got wrecked by weather, I would argue Mississippi. And given how there were at least dozen deaths within 2 tornadoes, especially Bassfield, Mississippi, it probably caused hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in damage across the state. Mississippi did see 2 EF4 tornadoes. This is really iffy. Did Mississippi get wrecked by the tornadoes enough as a statewide impact? Personally, given this, it tends to be on the border, I'm just going to go with a yes. However, because I know that we have to be sensitive to the people there, and I already included their water crisis. So I think I'm going to include this. Of course, in March, we saw Tennessee get wrecked by tornadoes. 25 deaths, $1.6 billion in damage due to the tornadoes. And yeah, that's about that. But the winter storm season was really sparing. And while Dallas did see a major EF3 tornado that did cause over $1.5 billion in damage, thankfully there were no deaths. This tornado was sparing. Also, I just realized I already included Texas, so I can't include them again. Whoops! And the primary weather event in 2019 in the Atlantic was Dorian. But Dorian, you see, affected the Bahamas the most severely. And I know you're just waiting for the Carolinas to hear about them getting wrecked. And if you are, that will be coming in the near future. So just sit tight. But a lot of these tornado events that you would think were just really destructive were actually really sparing. I mean, Bogard was hit hard by a tornado in March 2019, but it didn't really cause that many statewide impacts, as the 23 deaths were all in a small concentrated area. It wasn't a statewide event. The destruction, while tragic, was not something felt by the whole state. I'm going to have to say no on this one. And without these ginormous winter storm events, and with 2018 being very quiet tornadically, we looked to tropical cyclones. There were only really two that could have wrecked states. Michael hit Florida, which was counted. But Florence wrecked the Carolinas. 22 billion in North Carolina, 2 billion in South Carolina. Both saw around 24 deaths, so we saw about 50 between the two. Heavy flash flooding, wettest tropical cyclone in North Carolina. It might have only been a Cat 1 in North Carolina and a tropical storm in South Carolina, but winds do not matter. If the flooding is intense enough, a state can be wrecked. The Carolinas were definitely wrecked by Hurricane Florence. Both of them have been wrecked. And this is, I know, the moment that you've all been waiting for. But after this, we do have to understand that as how climactic that was, the rest of the year just kind of falls flat on its face in terms of weather. It just kind of does, because it kind of lacks all these major events that really were able to gain headlines. "2017 wrecked states, but they were already states that were impacted as far as the tropical cyclone fund goes. Georgia, however, did see 16 deaths in their state due to tornadoes, hundreds of millions of dollars in damage, and I think it became like one of the largest wintertime tornado outbreaks in the state. It was actually one of the largest wintertime tornado outbreaks of all, and this was in early January. So, yes, I will make the argument that Georgia was wrecked by these tornadoes. And as anticlimactic as this is, I do have to end the video now.